Continuing the theme of versatile subgenres, let's talk about post-metal. Personally, I dislike when genres are called post-something. For one, it implies that that genre is dead, which isn't always the case. Plus, it's kinda lazy. Oh, it's called post-grunge because it came after grunge. Aye, no shit. Every genre develops from the genres before it. Come up with your own name, you lazy fuds. That being said, I don't name these, so we're stuck with post-metal. At first glance, post-metal seems to just be prog metal, but even weirder. Upon further examination though, progressive metal is about making metal more complex and experimental and evolving it as a genre, while post-metal is about going beyond the boundaries of what metal even is. In prog, they're trying to elevate metal, whereas in post-metal, they're trying to transcend it. Metal is just used as a jumping off point to explore whatever musical ideas a band feels like. It shares the long songs and multiple sections of prog, and there's still fantastic musicianship in post-metal, but that's not focused on the same way it is in prog metal. Post-metal doesn't require odd time signatures or advanced music theory, because sometimes less is more. At times it feels like it's written into law that there has to be a bombastic guitar solo in every prog song, no matter what the song is about. But post-metal bands aren't afraid to take a minimalist approach when it's appropriate.
Last year my brother Fraser took his own life, and the only way I've been able to deal with that is actually through music.
And what's the piece called?
It's called The Empty Room.
Progressive music is obviously a big influence, but post-metal also uses elements of ambient, psychedelic, and even noise at times, and obviously it was heavily inspired by post-rock. Post-metal is generally associated with dark and sad songs, but artists really can do anything they want with it. You'll find all sorts of bizarre stuff under the post-metal label. Now technically, you could take the post-metal approach to any primary subgenre, but post-metal tends to favour doom metal and black metal. I talked about black gaze before, and most of that falls under post-metal. In fact, a lot of stuff does. It's another versatile subgenre where bands really can do whatever they want. Its development is largely credited to Godflesh and Neurosis in the 90s. The former played industrial metal and the latter played sludge, but their unconventional songwriting was very influential over post-metal, with fairly lengthy and atmospheric songs usually avoiding a traditional structure of verses and choruses, often mixing slow, ambient sections with heavy sections. Godflesh were also hugely important in establishing industrial metal as a subgenre, which is something I missed out in my industrial section. In fact, in a previous part I said that Fear Factory are one of the best examples of the industrial metal sound, but honestly, Godflesh really set the blueprint for the genre. Fear Factory are perhaps a good example of a more fast, aggressive style of industrial metal, but Godflesh are the quintessential melancholic and atmospheric industrial, and there's no denying their role in pioneering the genre. Now, people give the black metal community a lot of criticism for the alarming number of Nazis, but I find the post-metal fandom's open support of ISIS just as concerning.
Oh, hang on, I might have made a mistake here.
Yes, the unfortunately named ISIS are one of the most critically acclaimed bands in post-metal. Other bands of note include Pelican, Cult of Luna, Agaloch, and Wolves in the Throne Room. The last two of those fit under black gaze as well. To be honest, there's not a lot more I can say about this one. Its versatility makes it sound very difficult to summarise. Oh, and then there's avant-garde metal, which is just any prog or post-metal bands who are that extra level of pretentious that they need their subgenre to be in French. It's debatable whether post-metal counts as metal. Post-rock is generally considered to be rock, and post-punk is generally considered to be punk, but post-grunge is seen as something completely separate to regular grunge, so it's hard to say. I guess generally I'd say post-metal isn't metal because it's not trying to be. It's trying to be more than that. But there are still bands in the genre that I do think count. So, I'm gonna say the line again. You have to take bands on a case-by-case basis. I think on my subgenres model, post-metal can be considered a branch of the progressive metal family tree. At least it can be using definition A, but I think this model needs revised again. Now, obviously, every metal genre has to have at least some external influences, but I don't want to include subgenres which simply combine existing metal with another type of music. So even if you count metalcore as metal, it doesn't really belong here, and nor does progressive metal for that matter. The idea of primary subgenres is supposed to be like primary colours, in that you need them to make more colours. For instance, if you have a progressive metal band or a post-metal band, you need to pick one or more of these types of metal to make progressive. If you're a metalcore band, you'll be combining a mix of these with hardcore. If you're a folk metal band, you'll be adding folk music to one or more of these. This revised model fits both definitions A and B and anything else on the spectrum between those two extremes. Now, let me emphasise, a subgenre's exclusion from this chart does not mean it's not a real subgenre. It just means that it is made from one or more of these. Purple is its own colour, but you need to combine red and blue to get it. So, we've come full circle back to 6 primary subgenres. Full disclosure, of all the subgenres I've covered in this series, post-metal was the one I knew the least about before looking into it, so I hope I've done it justice. Now then, let's talk about another subgenre that relies on the primary subgenres. Now we move on to folk metal, which I had previously just skimmed over because it's so self-explanatory, but it's been around for a long time and has a dedicated fandom, so it's worth looking at its history. And honestly, I'm glad I decided to cover this in more detail because a lot of this stuff is fascinating. As I said before, folk metal is obviously a mix of metal and folk music. Usually, this is the folk music of whatever country the band is from. Although obviously there'd be nothing stopping an American folk metal band from playing Portuguese folk if they wanted to. A lot of the time, folk guitar melodies are played through classic heavy metal distortion, and this is often accompanied by traditional folk instruments like flutes, violins, bagpipes, accordions, hurdy-gurdies, or keyboards made to sound like folk instruments. Combining these elements with metal creates folk metal, but the specifics of the metal side of things can vary. Most commonly, folk metal uses heavy metal and power metal, but it can and does get combined with other subgenres. This means that it has a variety of vocal styles. Now, folk tends to be catchy and melodic, so clean vocals are the most common, but harsh vocal styles are also incorporated sometimes. Not only is there a wide variety of vocal styles, there's also a wide variety of languages. In fact, while plenty of subgenres have big international success, folk metal is probably the most multilingual of all the subgenres. Remember how I said that Norway is thought of as the land of black metal, and Sweden is thought of as the land of death metal? Well, Finland isn't just the home of death metal where the vocals are burped, it's also the home of folk metal. As for Denmark, I guess you guys have Merciful Fate and King Diamond going for you? Plus Lars Ulrich! I'm so sorry, Denmark. If you take any folk metal band, there's a good chance they're Finnish. The origins of folk metal, however, are credited to the English band Skyclad. They initially played thrash metal, but started to incorporate violins on their 1991 album, The Wayward Sons of Mother Earth. They then hired a fiddler into the band, as in the kind that plays a fiddle, not the kind that works for the BBC. At the time, combining metal with non-metal instruments was a novel concept only really used in prog, but it started to catch on a bit more. Throughout the 90s, a few bands incorporated other folk instruments and melodies into their style, sometimes only temporarily. Folk metal wasn't really popularised until the late 90s and early 2000s, as Fintroll became very successful for their niche. Their songs are mostly troll themed, not in the online sense, and I'll give you one guess as to where they're from. Bizarrely, most of the songs are in Swedish, partly because the vocalist is part of a minority of Swedish-speaking Finns, but the kayfabe explanation is that Swedish sounds more like a troll language. Okay then, they combine death metal with polka of all things, and I guess the sheer boldness of that combination blew the doors open for eccentric bands to incorporate whatever goofy folk ideas they liked into their music. Folk metal went from a trickle of new bands in the 90s to a rapid multiplication in the 2000s. It's not exactly chart topping, but it's more popular than you might expect. There are multiple folk metal festivals. The bands tend to be from Europe, and the lyrics are usually about folk mythology, nature, paganism, and drinking. In fact, one of Korpiglani's best known songs is about chugging vodka, and the other is about chugging beer, the latter of which has been covered by various bands in all sorts of other European languages. Other folk metal bands of note include Moonsorrow, Ensiferum, Heilung, and Skalmuld. There are a few American bands, although rather than playing their local folk music, which would probably end up being a fusion of country and metal, they tend to use European folk like the other bands do. One of the better known American folk metal bands is Agaloch, a band I mentioned already in post metal. They're a band of many labels: post metal, folk metal, black gaze, collecting all the name tags. Undoubtedly, the most popular folk metal band in recent memory is Ailstorm. Their memorable pirate gimmick certainly helped them, but it's clear from the several far less popular pirate-themed bands out there that the gimmick alone isn't what brought them success. They took the cheesy, fun sound of power metal and combined it with the catchiness of sea shanties and folk music to create singable and danceable party metal. Take that sound and make humorous songs in English about pirates, and in hindsight, it was a pretty ingenious idea for a band. There are plenty of folk metal bands with a similar sound, but their songs are usually in non-English languages and are often about obscure folklore that you would only know about if you're from their country. Meanwhile, by some massive coincidence, far more people speak English, including people from non-English speaking countries, and everyone knows about pirates. So it's no surprise that Ailstorm got as big as they are now. I have friends with no interest in metal whatsoever who still put on drink at parties. It's uncanny. Folk metal has of course led to its own variations. Many of these are regional depending on the local folk music of wherever the band are from. So Celtic metal obviously takes influence from Irish and Scottish folk music. And like the other regional variations, where the band are from tends to coincide with the kind of folk music that they incorporate, but the bands themselves don't actually need to be from that region. For example, one of the better known Celtic metal bands is Helveti, who are from Switzerland. The regional variations are fairly self-explanatory, so I won't go into those. Medieval metal originates from a German folk rock band called Subway to Sally, who started incorporating medieval instruments and melodies into their blend of hard rock and heavy metal folk music. So lutes, bagpipes, mandolins, hurdy-gurdies, and other medieval instruments playing medieval melodies alongside metal riffs makes up the medieval metal variation. Then we have Viking Metal. I've previously said that I don't consider this to be a real subgenre, but some people do, so it's worth explaining anyway. There are Viking-themed metal bands, such as Amon Amarth, who do not incorporate folk into their music, so they would not actually fall under this category. They would just be a melodeath band who make songs about Vikings. Viking metal is a mix of Scandinavian folk music with metal, usually first wave black metal specifically, on top of the lyrics being about Vikings. This specific combo is a result of Bathory. After their first 3 albums pioneered what black metal would look and sound like, their 4th album changed things up and used their harsh, dark sound to make songs about Vikings at war. Blood, Fire, Death is still celebrated by fans of black metal, thrash metal, and Viking metal, but their follow-ups got a bit more controversial. Hammerheart and Twilight of the Gods aren't particularly well regarded by black metal fans, but Bathory diving into Norse mythology encouraged the introduction of black metal into folk metal, and led to many bands writing about Odin. The best known Viking metal band is Tuir. Hailing from the Faroe Islands, sitting between Scotland and Iceland, this band is named after the Norse god of war. Yeah, that's right, dipshits. It's not Kratos. I think you'll find he's the Greek god of war. They play both metal riffs and folk melodies on their guitars, along with some very catchy choruses. Their songs are naturally about Vikings, Norse mythology, and paganism. Most of their songs are in English, but there are occasional lyrics in Faroese. Some of you might have raised an eyebrow at the Nordic runes, which I would say seems a tad paranoid, but given the issues with Nazism in black metal and folk metal lyrics often portraying an idealised version of the past, it's an understandable concern. Refreshingly, Tuir have quite explicitly condemned Nazis appropriating Norse symbols. And good on them. Runes are cool and they don't belong to cunts. Now, in my opinion, Viking metal is an unnecessary category. It seems like Viking metal bands are, for the most part, just folk metal bands who write about Vikings. Perhaps I think that because I'm not deep into folk metal and the distinction doesn't matter to me, but that's my take. And of course, you have variations based on which kind of metal is being infused with folk music. One thing I will say about heavier variations of folk metal is that the upbeat tone and tempo that it's known for isn't necessary, and there does exist some more melancholic folk metal out there. I'll use the example of my own favourite band within the folk metal umbrella, combining Scottish folk instruments with atmospheric black metal to create some beautiful, sombre music. I might be a tad biased in favour of this one, although I don't know how to pronounce the name of this particular solo project since I don't speak Scottish Gaelic. In fact, just over 1% of Scotland's population even does, so it's very difficult to find out how to pronounce anything. I looked through Wikipedia's little IPA guide to pronunciation, so I'll try my best. Sur. Folk metal wasn't included in my subgenres model because any folk metal band is a mix of one of these and the external non-metal influence of folk music, so there's not much point in giving it its own heading here. Here's a quick side note, if you count The Who as metal, then this is the subgenre they would fit in. More specifically, I guess folk heavy metal or perhaps folk groove metal when they use distortion, although even their undistorted stuff sounds pretty metal in the style of riffs. If you want to call The Who metal, that's your prerogative. I personally wouldn't, and would instead categorise them as Mongolian folk rock. Returning to the idea of fun metal, let's talk about black and roll and death and roll.
Thank you very much. Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Here we go!
As you've probably guessed, these subgenres combine metal's more extreme subgenres with old school rock and roll. Johnny be bad, am I right? The result is groovy and bluesy, but for the most part it still maintains the heaviness and atmosphere of the respective metal genres. Death and roll came first, as Swedish death metal legends Entombed took on a groovier style on their album Wolverine Blues. They retained their thick, heavy guitar tone and death growls, but slowed down the drums a bit. Now, groovy death metal is nothing new, and even particularly extreme bands like to slow things down on occasion, but specifically implementing a bluesy sound was something a little different. Entombed weren't deliberately trying to create a new approach, but Wolverine Blues and some of Entombed's output after that album provided the initial inspiration. This, combined with some bluesy tracks from Carcass and Gorefest, encouraged the development of this micro-genre, and there have been quite a few bands whose entire sound follows this fusion of rock and roll and death metal, including Helltrain and Debauchery, to just name a couple. 6 Feet Under also deserves some credit for implementing some bluesy rock and roll to their sound, including them doing death metal covers of classic rock songs. Sadly, that's not what they're remembered for. Black and roll is the same idea, but with black metal, with a lot of bands feeling inspired by black metal's rocky roots and venom. Sometimes the production is clear, and sometimes it's raw, but consistently, bluesy, evil riffs are played with black metal's signature shrieks over the top of them. Some credit has to go to Darkthrone, who, after losing interest in the black metal scene for obvious reasons, just kinda did whatever they felt like on each album, incorporating punk, doom, and sometimes rock and roll. Other established black metal bands, namely Satyricon and Carpathian Forest, have also experimented with the sound. But once again, there are plenty of bands entirely based around this fusion, such as Bunker 66 and Midnight, the latter of whom cross over into Blackened speed metal. There's quite a bit of overlap between Blackened speed and black and roll depending on how fast a band likes to play. Speed metal has had a revival since it was originally overshadowed by thrash in the 80s. Nowadays, speed metal provides the speed of thrash, but with just the sound of heavy metal and little in the way of punk or hardcore influences. Alongside Midnight, there's Speedwolf and my personal favourite, Hellripper. For all of black metal's Satan worship, I think black and roll is specifically the music Satan would actually listen to, because it sounds evil, but it also sounds like the band is having fun, and I can just picture demons dancing around a fire to it. Of course, I can't talk about black and roll without talking about the one band that has reached mainstream success. Kvelertak lean more towards the roll side of black and roll, but the black metal elements are still there, with shrieking vocals and the occasional blast beat. Their emphasis on the roll side of things makes their sound more accessible, and as such, for all their shrieking, their music doesn't sound too out of place at a party. They're popular enough to tour and collaborate with Mastodon, and the one time I saw Metallica live, they were the support act. Their recent output has further softened their sound, with use of clean vocals and less emphasis on the black metal parts, but their first few albums are, for the moment, the peak of commercial success for black and roll. It is for this reason that black metal fans hate them now. And with all that covered, I turn over to my audience's requests for what to cover. I'll go over the most popular requests in order of popularity, and once we get to very obscure stuff that only one person asked for, I'll be skimming it for time. So, next time, we'll start with symphonic metal. But until then, that'll do for part 10. See you next time.